The city lights of New Terra shimmered against the night sky, casting a golden glow over the bustling streets. Humans and aliens alike moved through the crowded district, their voices blending into a steady hum of life. Captain Dorian walked through the heart of it all, his military boots tapping against the pavement as he made his way to the negotiation hall. Tonight, he had a meeting that carried great significance, not only for the fragile alliance between humanity and the Zenthari, Dominion, but for himself, Commander Vayari. The name alone commanded respect. She was one of the Zenthari's highest-ranking officers, a warrior of unmatched discipline, known for her ruthless efficiency on the battlefield. Yet this meeting wasn't about war. It was about peace. Dorian had faced enemy fire, navigated asteroid fields, and survived deep space combat. But the idea of sitting across from Vayari in a diplomatic discussion made him uneasy in a way he couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was because he had heard the rumors, how she never removed her battlesuit, how she treated negotiations like warfare, how she held herself with the kind of composure that made lesser men break. When he entered the negotiation hall, he spotted her immediately. Vayari stood at the far end of the chamber, her arms crossed over her chest, back straight as steel. The Zenthari uniform clung to her form like a second skin, an advanced nanoweave material designed to enhance strength, regulate body temperature, and provide unparalleled protection. Its dark hue contrasted against her deep blue skin, accentuating the sharp angles of her physique. Dorian cleared his throat as he approached. "Commander Vayari," she turned to him, golden eyes locking onto his with unsettling precision. "Captain Dorian." Her voice was smooth, calm, but there was an intensity beneath the surface. She studied him, just as he studied her, both warriors measuring each other in the silent space between words. "I trust the accommodations are acceptable?" Dorian asked, gesturing to the diplomatic quarters. "They are sufficient," she replied, though something about the way she shifted her shoulders suggested discomfort. His gaze flicked downward, taking note of the subtle movements she made, the way her fingers twitched slightly against her arm, how she adjusted her stance every so often as if trying to relieve unseen tension. "You seem tense," he observed. Her eyes narrowed slightly, but instead of denying it, she let out a slow breath. "This uniform." She touched the high collar of her suit. "It is designed for combat efficiency. It compresses the muscles, regulates posture, ensures peak physical form at all times." She rolled one shoulder, a rare display of vulnerability. "But it is not made for comfort." Dorian smirked slightly. "Sounds exhausting." "It is necessary," she countered, "at least on the battlefield. But this isn't a battlefield," he pointed out. Vayari was silent for a moment, considering his words. Then, to his surprise, she exhaled, her fingers brushing over her uniform's collar again. "Then perhaps it is time to reconsider." Dorian felt his pulse quicken at the way she said it. Not just the words, but the tone. There was something different. In it, something almost human. "You mean to say you'd prefer something looser?" he asked, arching an eyebrow. Her golden gaze flicked back to him, unreadable yet sharp. "Are you suggesting I remove it, Captain?" Dorian coughed. "That's not... Well, I mean, that's entirely your decision, Commander." A small smirk ghosted across her lips. It was subtle, barely there, but it was the first crack in the hardened exterior she had maintained since arriving. "We should begin." "The negotiations," she said, shifting back into her formal stance. "Right," Dorian muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. "Let's talk peace." As they moved toward the negotiation table, Dorian couldn't shake the feeling that he had just stepped onto a battlefield after all. Only this time, the fight wasn't with weapons. It was something far more dangerous, and strangely, he didn't mind. The negotiations stretched late into the night, the weight of diplomacy pressing on both sides. Captain Dorian sat across from Commander Vayari, their discussions ranging from military cooperation to trade agreements. She was meticulous in her approach, dissecting every term, every clause, with a precision that mirrored the way she handled battle strategy. Dorian admired that about her, her sharp mind, her unwavering focus. But as the hours wore on, he couldn't help but notice the small signs of strain. Vayari's movements were measured, but occasionally her fingers flexed as if she were trying to relieve tension. She shifted in her seat more than once, rolling her shoulders ever so slightly. It was subtle, but to a trained soldier, such things were obvious. "Are you all right?" Dorian asked during a brief pause. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she exhaled slowly, pressing her fingers against the rigid collar of her uniform. "Your people favor comfort," she said, as if that thought had been occupying her mind. Dorian leaned back, raising an eyebrow. "Most of us do, yeah. We don't like feeling restrained." Vayari regarded him for a moment, her golden eyes studying him in a way that made it hard to tell what she was thinking. "The Xanthari believe that discipline is the foundation of strength. Restraint sharpens the mind, hardens the body. That is why our uniforms are designed this way, to ensure we are always prepared for battle." Dorian chuckled. "Sounds like you're always in fight mode." "That is our way." "Even when you're not fighting?" Vayari's gaze flickered slightly. It was the closest thing to hesitation he had seen from her. "Even then." Dorian gestured toward her uniform. "And that thing? It's part of it?" She nodded. "The suit compresses muscle fibers, maintains perfect posture, enhances reaction speed. It has been my second skin for years." "Sounds suffocating," he said. Vayari's lips pressed together slightly before she murmured, "It is." The admission surprised him. She had spoken it quietly, as if the words had escaped before she could stop them. Dorian smirked. "So why keep wearing it?" Her fingers brushed against her uniform's clasp before she caught herself and lowered her hand. "It is what is expected of me." "And what do you expect of yourself?" Vayari stared at him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, the air between them felt different, charged with something unspoken. Then she turned away slightly, breaking the moment. "We should continue the negotiations," she said, shifting back into her formal tone. Dorian exhaled, leaning forward again. "Right. Back to business." But as they resumed their talks, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. She was still the same warrior, still the same commander. But beneath all that discipline and duty, there was something else, something that, for the first time, she might be willing to explore. The next morning, Dorian expected another tense round of negotiations. He had mentally prepared for Commander Vayari's usual sharp demeanor, her rigid posture, and the suffocating presence of her battle-ready uniform. What he wasn't prepared for was the sight of her wearing human clothing. When she stepped into the meeting room, he almost didn't recognize her. Gone was the unforgiving Xanthari uniform. Instead, she wore a fitted black jacket over a simple dark shirt and comfortable trousers, standard attire provided to alien diplomats for casual wear. The difference was staggering. Without the restrictive suit clinging to her every muscle, she looked different. Not softer. That wasn't the word. She was still every bit the powerful warrior he had come to know. But without the armor-like uniform, she seemed less like an untouchable figure of war and more like a person. Dorian caught himself staring and quickly cleared his throat. "Well, this is new." Vayari tilted her head, golden eyes studying his reaction. "You disapprove?" "Not at all," he said quickly. "Just surprised. I wasn't sure if you'd actually go through with it." Vayari clasped her hands behind her back, a habit she must have picked up from years of strict military posture. "You spoke of human preference for comfort. I decided to experience it myself." Dorian smirked. "And? Any regrets?" She glanced down at herself briefly before answering. The fabric does not constrict movement. I am no longer required to brace my muscles against constant pressure. A pause. Then, with a subtle shift of her weight, she added, "It is acceptable." Dorian chuckled. "High praise from you." Her lips twitched, almost imperceptibly. "Do not grow arrogant, Captain." Despite her teasing remark, the mood between them felt different. The previous days had been filled with formalities, with carefully measured words and calculated movements. But now there was a shift, a slight ease to the way she spoke, the way she carried herself. As they resumed their discussions, Dorian noticed another change. Vayari was still precise, still disciplined in her arguments, but she wasn't as rigid as before. When he made a dry remark about human bureaucracy being its own kind of warfare, she actually smiled. A brief thing, but real. He hadn't expected to like the sight of it so much. When their session ended, they left the negotiation, whole together, walking through the corridors of the embassy. The artificial glow of the overhead lights cast a soft sheen on her deep blue skin, and Dorian found himself sneaking glances at her out of the corner of his eye. "You're adjusting quickly," he commented. Vayari gave a slow nod. "I have observed that humans adapt to change more readily than my people. I seek to understand why. Maybe it's because we don't believe in holding on to things that don't work for us." Vayari's gaze flickered toward him. "You imply my uniform was limiting me. You said it yourself. It kept you tense, always ready for battle. But you're not fighting right now, are you?" She considered this for a moment. Then, to his surprise, she murmured, "No, I am not." They stopped outside her quarters. She turned to face him fully, her golden eyes sharp, yet thoughtful. "This is unfamiliar territory for me, Captain, but I find it not unpleasant." Dorian smirked. "Careful, Vayari. You might start liking human customs." Her lips quirked at the edges again. "I shall reserve judgment, for now." She lingered for a moment as if debating whether to say something more. Then, with a slight incline of her head, she stepped inside her room, the door sliding shut behind her. Dorian exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. He was in real trouble. The next few days passed in a way Dorian hadn't expected. The negotiations between humanity and the Zenthari continued, but they were no longer just dry discussions filled with strict formalities. Vayari had changed, not in a dramatic way. She was still sharp, still disciplined, still carried herself like the warrior she was. But there was something different in how she interacted with him now. She spoke more freely. She listened differently. And, more than once, Dorian caught her observing humans not with detachment, but with curiosity. And then, there was the matter of her uniform. She never put it back on. Instead, she continued wearing the human attire provided to her. And each time Dorian saw her, he noticed something small but significant. How her shoulders no longer looked so stiff. How she moved with a new kind of ease. How her presence felt less like an unyielding force and more like something closer. One evening, as the negotiations wrapped up earlier than usual, Vayari surprised him again. "I wish to see more of this city," she said. Dorian raised an eyebrow. "You want to go out? With me?" "You are the only human I have spent considerable time with," she stated matter-of-factly. "You will provide context for what I observe." Dorian smirked. "So I'm your guide now?" "If you object, I don't," he cut in, amused. "Come on, let's get out of here." They walked through the lively streets of New Terra, surrounded by a mix of human and alien cultures blending together in the neon-lit cityscape. Vendors sold food from carts, music drifted from open shop fronts, and laughter echoed from nearby gathering spots. Vayari took everything in with sharp, assessing eyes. "Your world is Chaotic, Dorian chuckled. That's one way to put it. She glanced at a couple sitting at a small outdoor cafe, leaning into each other, lost in quiet conversation. A group of friends burst into laughter near a street performer, juggling glowing orbs. A child ran past them, chasing a small floating toy. "This ease with which your people express themselves," Vayari murmured, "is uncommon among the Zinthari. You don't show emotions openly?" She shook her head. "Not in the way humans do. Strength is measured in control. To reveal too much is considered weakness," Dorian frowned. "That sounds lonely." Vayari turned to him, something unreadable flickering in her golden eyes. "It is what I have always known." For a moment they stood there, the hum of the city around them, and Dorian realized how much she had changed in just a few days. This wasn't the same commander who had walked into the embassy wrapped in duty and restraint. This was someone who was learning something new about herself, step by step, and somehow he was part of that change. "Come on," he said, nudging her arm lightly. "Let's find something new for you to experience." She gave him a curious look, but followed. Dorian wasn't sure what this night would mean for either of them, but one thing was certain. Vayari wasn't just learning about humans. She was learning about herself, and so was he. As the night stretched on, Dorian led Vayari through the streets of New Terra, showing her the small but vibrant things that made human life so different from her own. They stopped at a food stall, where he handed her a steaming skewer of grilled meat. She studied it with suspicion before taking a careful bite. Her golden eyes widened slightly, and for the first time, she made an unguarded sound, a quiet hum of appreciation. "You like it?" Dorian asked, amused. Vayari chewed thoughtfully, before nodding. "It is. Rich. Satisfying. Good. Because if we're doing this properly, you have to try dessert next." She tilted her head. "Dessert? Sweet food. Completely unnecessary, but completely worth it." They ended up at a small cafe where Dorian ordered a slice of chocolate cake. Vayari regarded it warily before taking a bite. This time, her reaction was even more noticeable, a slight widening of her eyes, the faintest quirk at the corner of her lips. Dorian grinned. "I think I just witnessed a breakthrough." Vayari arched a brow. "You place great importance on food." "Food's just an excuse," he said, leaning forward. "It's about enjoyment, about taking a moment to just be." She was quiet for a long time, tracing a fingertip along the edge of her plate. "The Zinthari do not live this way. We exist for purpose, for duty. And what if you could exist for yourself too?" She met his gaze, something shifting behind her. Golden eyes. "That is not easy to answer." Dorian didn't press. Instead, he leaned back with a smirk. "Well, at least we know you like chocolate. That's a start." Vayari exhaled softly. Not quite a laugh, but close. They left the cafe and continued walking through the quiet streets. The city had settled into its late-night rhythm, the neon glow reflecting off the damp pavement. At some point, they stopped, at an overlook, gazing down at the shimmering lights of New Terra. Vayari stood beside him, her arms crossed, but there was no tension in her stance anymore. She wasn't holding herself like a soldier. She was simply standing there. Dorian turned to her. "So, what do you think?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she slowly reached up and unfastened the high collar of her jacket, letting the cool night air touch her skin. It was a small action, but it meant everything. She exhaled. "This is the first time I have felt truly at ease in a long time." Dorian watched her, something warm settling in his chest. "I'm glad." Vayari turned her head slightly, her golden gaze locking onto his. "You have shown me much, Captain Dorian, and yet I suspect there is still more I do not understand." He smirked. "Yeah? Like what?" She stepped closer, her presence suddenly much more tangible in the cool night air. Like this, she murmured. This feeling I have when I look at you. Dorian's breath hitched slightly. Oh? She studied his face, as if searching for an answer. It is unfamiliar, and yet I do not dislike it. Dorian swallowed. I think I know what it is. Vayari's gaze flickered to his lips for the briefest moment before returning to his eyes. Then, perhaps you should explain it to me. Dorian chuckled softly. I'd rather show you. And then, cautiously, as if giving her every chance to pull away, he kissed her. For a heartbeat, she remained still. Then, slowly, she leaned into it. The moment was quiet, simple. But in that moment, Vayari, warrior, commander, disciplined soldier, was just Vayari. When they finally pulled apart, she exhaled, her voice almost a whisper. Yes, I think I understand now. Dorian grinned. Told you you'd like human customs. Vayari smirked, a real, genuine smirk. Perhaps, she murmured. But I believe I shall need further lessons. Dorian laughed. I think that can be arranged. As they stood together under the glow of the city, something had changed between them, not just in words, but in something far deeper. Vayari had come to negotiate peace between their people. Instead, she had found something she never expected. And Dorian had found her,